All right, well, I'm happy to affirm the resolution that social media giants like Twitter and Facebook should censor violent groups like Antifa or the alt-right. Let's get to a few observations and definitions, and we'll continue into the main arguments. First, violence refers to direct physical harm to other people, but in this case, it can also refer to stuff like looting or, any sort of, demonstrable social chaos that is caused by these activities. The other thing that I want to mention is that the resolution is talking about an assumption of violence. If a group isn't being violent, then of course it's no concern. What we're talking about is social media giants for groups that are knowingly violent and are promoting violence should say either don't be violent or you can remain on the site if you aren't violent, but if you choose to engage in that, then you're going to get kicked off. That's what censorship will be. And as long as they choose to be violent, they will be censored on the site. The other thing I want to say is that free speech is a non-issue. Free speech relates to how the government makes legal an opinion or bans it from being spoken. Social media giants are private businesses, so the discussion is a little bit different. Let's jump down into what I believe is the most important weighing mechanism. This is social safety, a basic guiding principle that all people should take into account. We drive carefully because we're concerned about the well-being of others. Governments make laws to ensure society's well-being. This should be at the forefront of our minds as we discuss this topic. Let's get down into my two main arguments. The first is of dangerous power. The second is of legitimate control. So first, that of dangerous power. The three key phrases I want you to remember when we talk about violent groups are misinformation, radicalization, and coordination. These are three levels of problems that exist when you allow these violent institutions like Antifa or the alt-right, but many others too, like terrorist organizations, to stay on social media. For one, they have the potential to misinform other people. At the lowest level, they're going to cause confusion to someone who's not particularly savvy with news. Everything we've seen about fake news spills over here, that these kinds of radicalized groups are more likely to misinform the public, to decrease social education and potentially make things really dangerous. I mean, if shouting fire in a crowded theater is illegal, why should it be legal to spread mass information and chaos and potentially make things really bad? The second thing is radicalization, that violent groups will tend to use social media as a way to radicalize others. Think about ISIS, for example, on Twitter is notorious for finding other people, sharing news over DMs, or even just tweeting information about them. It's an easier way for them to connect because it's such a powerful base. And the third thing is of coordination, that even if these violent groups don't even have friends they're connected to, they still will be able to coordinate amongst themselves over a powerful communication tool, and we shouldn't really give that to them. The second argument is of legitimate control. It is totally reasonable for private businesses to silence people off of their, or to put people out of their business that personally discuss them. Just like if you're having your friends over and one of them says, I really love ISIS, you're more than welcome to tell him to leave. So it's reasonable for them to censor people that are violent and that are causing social chaos.
All right, g'day. I'm Liam, so I'll be on the con. So just a couple of things to identify to start with. The first thing, and this is the last thing that Lewis said in his speech, is that it's legitimate for Facebook and Twitter to do this. I agree, it's legitimate for them to do this. This motion is that they should be doing this. So we're not debating the legality of it, but whether or not it would be beneficial for them and the way in which they should be acting. Additionally, the argument about dangerous power, I also think is in tension what he previously said in his speech. He says shouting fire in a crowded theater is something should be illegal. Why should this be illegal as well? He also made it not about the government when he makes it not about free speech. These are private entities, they can do as they wish. Both of those arguments are things that are not persuasive in this debate by precisely the metrics that Lewis gave. I'm going to identify a couple of things. And note that this motion requires the pro not to just stop people from advocating for violence, which is something Lewis supports, but the other thing that he supports is that them just being violent at all. The stance I'm going to take on con is your actions outside of your social media environment, that is to say engaging in violence or looting, should not be contingent on your participation in that service. And the best intuition pump for this is as follows. We force bakeries to bake cakes for people who want to be engaged in gay weddings. Gay weddings might be something that you find personally distasteful in the same way you find violence distasteful, but we force you to do it anyway because it is an action that is outside of the purview of that service. This is precisely the same. I'm going to talk about some obligations that Facebook has because this is a should debate. You ought set up the way in which they should be acting. The first thing I'm going to identify is what I said before, is that actions outside of the provision of a service should not change the provision of that service. Now, Lewis says that this is actually private property. You can do whatever as you please. That is not the case. It is not the same as the analogy is going to a house. And the reason for that is that when you invite someone to your house, that's a social event. This is social media, and the service that they provide you is connectedness. The service they provide you is information, and the service they provide you is being able to talk to others. Now, we would not allow Facebook to censor or ban people, but just because of their race or because of their gender orientation or because of their sexual orientation. We also should not do it because of their political motivations or motivations motivations outside of that space. For example, we still allow murderers to have Facebook accounts, even though they do things which endanger the public safety. Secondly, Facebook and Twitter are entrenched monopolies, which means there's no alternatives, which means that gives them an extra obligation upon them because in absence of them, there is no other service for them to go to. So it's very important that they provide this service to everyone unless they have legitimate means for not providing that service. And I don't think Lewis has provided a legitimate means for that. In my next speech, I'll talk about why this is better for Facebook.
First, on his argument about outside action shouldn't determine, my response is murder versus muffins. Okay, if you're a bakery and you don't want to bake cakes for someone who's gay, yeah, we can reasonably override that. That's not really what I'm contesting. What I'm contesting are people that, A, use social media as a way to be more violent. Again, my opponent doesn't respond to the three ways that social media is used: to spread misinformation, to promote radicalization, and to provide coordination. This is not some random, isolated outside action people don't like. I mean, the big difference is, A, this exists within social media. That's the number one big thing. But the second thing is, these are not just personally offensive, these are personally harmful ideas. My opponent has forgotten that the word violent is in the resolution. We're not just talking about any old belief. So in response to outside action not important, no. Inside action is important. And if people are being violent within a social media institution, of course they should be kicked off, as well as the fact if they're promoting it and advocating for it on the site, that's extremely dangerous. The second thing, he says, well, political motivation shouldn't matter. Murderers can have Facebooks. Okay, my response is activism is different. We're not talking about some ex-murderer who's kind of, made his way back and is repented of his proverbial sins, or not so proverbial sins. We're talking about groups that are violent, meaning groups that promote and advocate for violence, not just happen to have committed it before, as we talked about in the definitions. So this activism is way more dangerous. Let's come back to the other thing that's really important. He says, well, we have to be talking about should actions here. This is why a weighing mechanism is so important and why you should be looking at the issue of social safety. That when groups are knowingly and intentionally causing damages to social safety, meaning they are endangering the lives of other people, they are spreading misinformation, they are and not just like, we missed the figures on how many people at the inauguration, like actual misinformation that can cause people to be more radicalized and angry, stuff too that coordinates violence or radicalizes others. This is all stuff that's directly harmful. It's far outside the realm of just personal disagreement. So in the interest of making sure that other people are safe, not just on the site, but outside, social media should do what they can to disavow of these illegitimate political opinions that violence and hurting other people is acceptable.
All right, so the first thing I'm going to identify is what Lewis is defending, and you can rewind to rewatch the first speech if you don't believe me. He's defending two things. Censoring people who advocate for violence, I support that. I agree with him there. The thing that I disagree with him is that when he says, if you choose to go out and do these things, extra to that, that is when we are also going to censor you. That's what he said in his first speech, and that's what the motion requires him to defend. That is the thing that I disagree with, because your outside actions should not take into account. What is his responses? His first response is to say is that these groups are not individuals doing bad things, they're groups doing bad things. Firstly, just because a group is doing that shouldn't make it any different. Secondly, they also do a lot of good things. For example, Antifa does a lot of stuff like charity work. They do stuff like supporting in the Houston rescues, or what was the other one I had written down? Relief efforts for Hurricane Harvey. They do lots of good things as well. They're not just purely violent. So it seems strange that you would just vest Facebook with the requirement to decide the net good of these things when it's a company that historically proven that's incapable to do so. Importantly, that is also the same for individual people. Individual people in their own lives do good things and do bad things, but Facebook does not control their outside life. And the reason for this is Facebook control starts and ends when you log in, when you watch other videos on Facebook, and when you talk to other people on Facebook. Other than that, they should have and do not have any control. That is why, and the final thing, murder is still an action. Violence is still an action. That's why that analogy is still the same there. I'm now going to talk about why this is beneficial for Facebook. The important thing to note here is that Facebook has a legal fiduciary obligation to its shareholders. It's a public company, which means that you can buy shares. When that's the case, you have to maximize the amount of profit for that company or for those shareholders. And if you don't do so, it's strictly against the law. So if I can demonstrate that this action is something that would decrease profits for shareholders, that is something that is illegal for Facebook to do and therefore should not do. The first thing to note here is what is the business model of Facebook. It is a model that revenue raises through clicks on ads, and those ads are something that that obviously more viewers are there, more clicks. Now, the thing I want to note is that because Facebook is a monopoly, as I pointed out before, there's very little other alternatives. Those investors who put those ads on are invariant and are inelastic to what is on the site. What I'm likely going to point out here, so obviously that's different from QallOut, which has like specific restrictions as a news site. Now, if you remove these groups, it's seen as taking a political observation in clearly politically charged groups. And given the culture war that is happening, Facebook needs to remain impartial if it wants to continue to be the stage upon which these things are discussed in the future. And importantly, it also has also doesn't want to be seen on the wrong side of history if that was so the case. These are both things that decrease shareholder profits because it decreases the respect that people have for that company.
What's important to recognize is that there is a distinction between political discrimination and not wanting violence. We've walked away, not we, my opponent has walked away from the word violence in the resolution. The action of direct physical harm towards other people. Groups that are advocating for that are pushing for more people to do it. Should we really be giving them a chance on social media? My opponent is saying, well, that'd be just about as bad as not baking a cake for a gay wedding. You know, to not allow people posting videos of them torturing other people in the streets or beating them over the head with clubs. Truly, there is a similarity equation. I feel like that this is ridiculous. This is a separate red herring issue that we could have political discrimination, especially too when the freaking resolution is very bipartisan. It takes a far left group and a far right group and is saying that that social media giants should not allow their violence. This is the most bipartisan comparison we could possibly have. So in response to his whole like tax investors thing, which isn't even supported with economic analysis, he's just like, well, what if people got mad and then that would be bad? Well, I think more people are happy that ISIS doesn't have Twitter accounts than that they do. I mean, I would dare say that no one's begging for violence to be back on social media outside of the people perpetrating it. I mean, I just think that this argument is silly. This is a bipartisan ban on violence. It could be as well written into the terms and conditions that you sign up for. If it isn't already, it might even. That being said, let's look up to his first argument. He says, well, you know, people who go out, their outside action shouldn't be used as a judge. My response is groups use activism. I don't know what my opponent is saying here about just random individuals that go out and do acts of violence. I mean, that's not what the resolution is about. It's about groups that are using violence. And most notably, these kinds of political groups that are using violence are using social media to accomplish it. They're using it to spread misinformation and radicalize other people. They're using it to coordinate with others. I mean, Twitter has banned like hundreds of different ISIS Twitter accounts for the reason that they use it for coordination. So my opponent's saying, well, you know, what if you're just an average guy, you know, who likes to go out and occasionally murder other people? You don't want really social media institutions to judge you based on that. I mean, like that's the only way his argument begins to sound tenable. These are groups that are active and are advocates of violence. They are not just random political opinions we decide to throw out the water. I mean, he says, well, some do charity. I mean, guys, this is ridiculous. Are we really going to make this a math contest of, well, you know, if ISIS donates a lot of food to a homeless shelter, then it's okay that they promote violence on social media? I mean, there's no contest here. You have the choice to censor violence, which knowingly and unfortunately quite effectively radicalizes other people into groups, increases social confusion, and we know without a doubt, will increase the chances of other people getting harmed by the fact that they can coordinate. Or we have a chance to do the sensible thing and allow social media for people with legitimate political opinions who are not ready to cause physical harm to others.
The first thing, if my opponent wants to accuse me of making silly analogies, for example, those individuals committing crimes, then he's also making a silly analogy when he analogizes these political groups in the West to a fucking terrorist group. Obviously, ISIS is significantly different given that its stated goal is terror and misinformation. The stated goal of Antifa is to move the political spectrum more left to account for things like a capitalist system. They have I don't agree with either of their extreme political ideologies, but they are reasonable political ideologies to want to support. Importantly, when he claims that I'm making this about a math test, I'm not. I'm saying that it seems weird that Facebook would be able to adjudicate the goodness and badness of these groups, given that both groups do good and bad things. The intuition pump here, and this is a question for Lewis that Joseph, that I would ask, would you support Facebook banning things like the military or the government, which do good things and bad things?
In what context? Which militaries? You have to make the question more specific.
The Australian or American militaries, which both do good and bad things.
No, I don't think so, because I don't think militaries. I mean, again, pick a military, then maybe my answer will change. When you try to contrast complex foreign policy decisions that are made with the best interest of people in mind versus a terrorist radicalized group trying to hurt others. I mean, you say, by the way, that it's total BS that like groups like the alt-right and Antifa would be compared to terrorism. I mean, there have been dozens of cases of domestic terrorism from groups radicalized by the alt-right. I don't think it's at all a bad analogy.
Right. They're not acting in their best interest. They're acting in a political ideology in exactly the same way armies do when they invade places like Iraq for oil. They confect things. The thing I'm pointing out here is that, as I said in my previous speech, I know that Lewis is very good at framing things and making you feel emotionally invested. But look at the logic of this. Facebook is providing a service to you. What other service puts impositions on you when you leave that service? Facebook would have to be the only one of these things that Lewis is supporting, and they don't exist anywhere else. I want to clarify and stress again. I do not support these groups advocating for violence. I do support these groups being allowed to stay on the platform if they are engaged in violence elsewhere. In exactly the same way that if Lewis doesn't think I should analogize it to groups, I'll just analogize it to the government. Should the government allow things like the American police, should Facebook allow the American police force, which is a group, to maintain on Facebook when its actions are often very bad for minority communities in America in the terms of over-policing and police brutality? The thing I'm pointing out here is just because you do shit things outside of the service, why should you be limited in that service?
It's very interesting that my opponent doesn't support people using social media for the promotion and advocacy of violence. It's almost as if my opponent forgets that social media is probably the most effective tool to coordinate with other people in a violent best ways to spread misinformation and to radicalize other individuals. My opponent is saying, oh, of course, I agree with the resolution in virtually every way that it plays out in the real world when these violent groups use the social media platform to turn other people for their side. I just don't support the resolution when it's picking a group that is known for being violent and never uses social media for anything violent, but just did a violent thing on the side. I mean, that is, first off, that does not exist within Antifa or the alt-right. It's an irrelevant example that some really violent group known for violent activism doesn't in any way use social media to gain followers for its cause, but commits an isolated violent thing outside and Facebook says, I think we're going to discriminate. Well, I would support that if a violent group looks like they're absolutely likely to spread misinformation, violence, harm, extremism to other people, that they shouldn't be allowed because they aren't a legitimate voice and they are a danger to other people, not just on the site, but other people in the real world. So with that being said, he says, well, this isn't the same because, look at examples like militaries. Would we allow them to be allowed? We have to remember the uniqueness in violent groups on social media. That these violent groups, like Antifa, the alt-right, and take other terrorist groups too. The resolution isn't limited to just politically relevant violent groups that we're familiar with in the US, or that my opponent's familiar with in Australia, where we're talking about violent groups. And these are just two examples of ones that we wouldn't want on. Think about what's unique about these groups. A military is very different. I mean, a military doesn't rely on picking up random bystanders off the street to join them as they invade Iraq. Like a police force isn't looking for other people to join them as they shoot a minority. It's very different. But these kinds of violent groups are looking for the everyday supporter. They are looking for the bystander to radicalize. And my opponent has not addressed this key issue of radicalization and cooperation, that this is what they want. They need growth to spread because they aren't popular now. Why would we give them the loudest microphone when the only thing that they're shouting is violence? I feel like this is ridiculous.
Republicans are against abortion. Are all Republicans against abortion?
No.
Precisely. I want to look at the other side of the coin. As I said before, Lewis is very good at framing, but look at the opposite side. Yes, these groups are known for violence. They're also known for the very good charity and good works that they do. For example, as I pointed out, relief support under Hurricane Harvey in America. These are things that they also do, that they also advocate for. The thing I'm pointing out here is when they advocate for violence, they should be stopped, as is Facebook's terms of service. But when they do not advocate for violence and they just happen to do violent things outside, they also do good things outside. You really need to identify the tension in Lewis's argument here because it's really unpersuasive. Further, a lot of the things that these groups do are particularly legal. They do send petitions. They do write letters. They do protesting, which is legal for their own reasonable political ideologies. There are individuals, I agree, who do crazy things that is not, one, representative of the entire group, and two, even if it is, doesn't respond to the argument that this is something that is outside Facebook's purview. It's really unclear why Lewis thinks that Facebook has to take the moral mantle of defending society, even though it's just offering a service. In no other way does any other company do this thing. The final thing I want to claim is that the distinction he makes between the military and or like police forces and these groups is that they don't pick people up off the street. That's okay, but these are political groups. Their point is to expand. Their point is to get more people believing their things. That is reasonable for a political group to do in the same way that the Republican Party or the Democratic Party does. I don't have to support them being violent in that. They do lots of other non-violent things. There's obviously an incentive in the media to amp up that violence because it makes for better stories and it's more politically palatable for the people who are making these stories. I want to point out again, Facebook is a service. What other service would limit your actions post the conclusion of that transaction?
Question for you, Liam. If a violent group of people, regardless of political affiliation, is trying to get signatures to assassinate a politician and sharing it around social media, should that group stay on Facebook or be kicked out?
Obviously, it's not a legitimate petition, the thing I identified, but and if they're advocating for the signing of that particular petition, absolutely they should be removed because it's exactly the same as advocating for violence. It is not the same as protesting. It is not the same as doing all of the other legal and charitable things I pointed out earlier.
Okay, then. So my opponent, I seem to agree that the resolution is true. He just thinks that certain groups should also have ability to picket and shout their opinions out. I'm in support of the First Amendment alongside my opponent, but the First Amendment doesn't allow for violence. I mean, this is the most important word in the resolution, and my opponent is just walking away from it. He's trying to pull to other examples like, well, what if a police force does some bad stuff? Should they be allowed on? He's ignoring the uniqueness in violent groups. So allow me to illustrate this. Now, I want to say, by the way, I appreciate the compliments about my framing, but I would also say that I'm not just good at framing, but I'm reasonable in doing it. What I said at the very beginning about censorship is that this is not just any group that just we consider to be violent at some point in time. What we're saying is if the group continues to be violent, they will be kicked off. If they are not a violent group, and this is what Liam's saying, he's like, well, the groups don't have to be violent. If the groups aren't violent, then they don't fall under the resolution and they, of course, will be allowed on. We're talking about groups that are violent in the present, not just, some people within the group may have done one thing. We're talking about an actual violent group per the wording of the resolution. So asking me about framing, you should have responded to that to the very beginning if you had an issue with the idea of censoring a group that's currently being violent. That's what it means. So my opponent's already agreed to that. Like he's literally told you in the Q&A that if a group is using social media for violence, that they should be kicked off. I mean, this is the biggest admission out of Khan. How are we saying that they shouldn't eliminate violent groups if them using social media and being violent is the reason for them to be kicked off? So let's get down to his second argument. He was the argument about charity. Okay, first, charity doesn't outweigh terrorism. If you advocate for a terroristic act in public, your donations to a hurricane fund shouldn't outweigh that. The second thing is peaceful groups versus violent groups. If Antifa wants to not be a violent group ever again and wants to only support peaceful things, then yes, they can stay on. As I said in the beginning, this applies to currently violent groups, to groups, as the resolution makes, the assumption of violence. If they're not being violent, then that's fine. If they want to stop that unilaterally. But at the moment that they step forward and use their tools, the power of social media for violence, they should be kicked off. Okay, the second thing is, why aren't other companies doing this? My response is, with great power comes great responsibility. Social media has a chance to reach more people than literally any other business has ever in the course of human history. I mean, billions of people on Facebook. And that's one of the core reasons why they should be in the front runner to eliminate the radicalization and potential for harm that exists to other people. He also says, yeah, well, the police are looking for support. This is not analogous. Supporting the police is very different from supporting a group like Antifa. There's not a controversy as to whether or not terrorism is okay. If a group is being violent and is continually using social media as a way to radicalize and cooperate with other groups, they should be kicked off. The funny thing is, I'm not actually seeing disagreement to this. I'm just saying, well, people should be allowed to picket and protest. That's different from the physical harm to other people, the definition of violence that my opponent concedes from the very beginning of the round.
Okay, so if you're judging this, I'd like you to look back to your notes on my first and second speeches, or perhaps rewind if you want to watch it, because I feel like I've made this painfully clear. I agree that advocating for violence should not be the thing that Lewis has just said, in the same way he said it in his first and second speeches, and what I said in those first and second speeches, is that just because you continue to be violent outside of that organization does not warrant that organization from restricting you in other circumstances. For example, if a business does shady tax practices, that doesn't mean that other companies don't trade with it. If an individual has really abhorrent political beliefs, that doesn't mean that any other business will refuse to engage with them. And if they do, that is discrimination. That is illegal and is not something that they are allowed to do. So I want to be clear. Lewis has to defend why outside the service of Facebook, they should be restricted. Additionally, his next claim is to say, well, donations help people, but they don't help people as much as terrorism hurts people. I mean, I guess perhaps ask the people in Hurricane Harvey, and I'm sure they might disagree with you. But that's beside the point. It's not about the numeric amount. It's about the justness of what they are doing. And I'm saying just because they do something bad outside of Facebook doesn't mean they should be harmed in Facebook. Similarly, just because they don't do something good outside of Facebook doesn't mean Facebook should give them extra privileges. We're not agreeing on the topic here. He has to defend the inherent thing about violent groups. That means that they ought be banned or ought be censored as opposed to their actions outside of it. The next thing he says is, well, great power comes great responsibility. I actually said this in my first speech, where I'm like, they're a monopolistic platform which gives them an obligation to allow people to access it. In exactly the same way, they have an obligation to allow people to do things when they're not doing anything wrong on that platform. In the same way that QallOut doesn't boot people off for being terrible people in real life. It's really unclear why this is any different. Finally, he says the police are different. That wasn't my response. My response is that these things are political movements, which means that they should be engaging in trying to collect people off the street, just like every other political movement does. They do lots of legal things. They do lots of illegal things. Why is it external to that Facebook? They must be punished.
I have a quick question for you, Liam. Can you name me any violent group that doesn't use social media to advocate for their violence?
No.
That's really all that you need to know to vote pro. Violent groups will use social media to advocate their values. My opponent is saying in the fringe example where there's a violent group that doesn't at all use social media for their tool of violence, allow them to be on. First off, that is a minority support of the resolution, not enough for you to vote con. And the second thing is that in the real world, these groups will use social media for their tools of evil. They will be taking the essential weapon that Facebook has given them and making life pragmatically worse for other people. We should be making ISIS' job harder. We should be making violent groups' jobs harder, not giving them the easiest possible tool they have to radicalize and cause chaos in society.
Yeah, it's true that any individual group may use Facebook to advocate. As I said for 10th time now, I'm against that advocation. Why is it that they have to be removed from that group? They could still have a Facebook page. They could still publicize the good things they do. They could still have petitions. They can still highlight when they're going to do protests. All reasonable things. Why is it that just because of bad things they do, they shouldn't be allowed to access this service? Name me another service that this occurs on.
Not enough. If a group is using your social media platform, which is a communicative tool, for violence, it means that that tool can cause more violence. It is the megaphone by which you make your impact on the world far worse. Social media giants have a responsibility to do that, because if they don't, more people will be harmed by the violence. It's that simple.
Megaphone by which they make it better for their political ideology. But as I said before, you can stop the megaphone aspect by when they advocate for bad things. But why is it the doing of bad things means that they should be removed from the site?
Comes back to the core issue of social safety, that if Facebook is allowing people who regularly and consistently harm that, they shouldn't be allowed on. Charity doesn't outweigh terrorism. You cannot just say, because I donated to Hurricane Harvey, I should continue to turn my megaphone up and radicalize other people. The core issue is violence is nonpartisan. You don't need to be left or right, as the resolution says, to ban it, and Facebook should.
My argument is not that charity outweighs terrorism. My argument is that there are good and bad things. If the good thing does not confer extra privileges on Facebook in the same way that bad things outside of Facebook should not confer extra restrictions on Facebook. There's an inconsistency in this pro's case. The thing you need to know when you're voting on this debate is that painfully I've made it clear is that there's nothing inherent about having a violent group there if they're not advocating for that thing when they are just advocating for their other good things. A question I've asked many times, which has not received a satisfactory response. And that is the reason to vote con, because they have an obligation to those individuals who enter that service. And while they are in that service, they should be restricted. But outside